I learned the value of persistence from my father's calloused hands, watching him resurrect engines that others had declared dead. 67 years old now, and I still feel that same reverence for machinery that speaks in clicks and hums rather than words. My workshop sits on 3 acres of Alabama clay, where rusted hulks and forgotten dreams gather like old friends. Rex, my German Shepherd mix, has been my constant companion for 8 years now, his graying muzzle matching my own weathered face. He knows the sound of every wrench in my toolbox, the rhythm of my work, the way I pause when something doesn't feel right. Those early mornings when frost still clings to windshields and the coffee tastes stronger than usual, Rex positions himself near the shop entrance, ears alert for the first customer's approach. His presence has become so integral to my daily routine that I sometimes catch myself explaining repair procedures to him, watching his intelligent eyes track my movements as if he truly understands the intricacies of carburetor adjustments and timing chains. Growing up in Millerville, population 1,200, you learn to fix things or do without. Dad owned the only garage for 20 miles, and I spent every afternoon after school learning that every engine has a story, every broken part a reason. The smell of his shop still haunts my memories, motor oil mixed with cigarette smoke, the metallic tang of freshly cut steel, and something indefinable that I later recognized as the scent of honest work. Mom would call us in for supper, grease still under our fingernails, and she'd shake her head with that knowing smile. 2 peas in a pod, she'd say, both of you talking to machines better than people. She wasn't wrong. I found peace in the logic of pistons and valves, the honesty of metal and oil. When something was broken, you could see why. When you fixed it right, it worked. No pretense, no hidden agendas, just cause and effect, problem and solution. Dad taught me that every tool had its place and purpose, that respect for equipment translated into respect for the craft itself. His hands, permanently stained with decades of automotive fluids, could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. I watched him lean over countless hoods, head cocked slightly to the left, listening to mechanical symphonies that told stories of neglect, abuse, or simply the inevitable march of time and miles. The garage became my sanctuary during those formative years, a place where the complexities of adolescence simplified into tangible challenges with achievable solutions. While other kids my age struggled with social hierarchies and teenage drama, I found solace in the straightforward nature of mechanical problems. A seized engine either freed up or it didn't. A worn transmission either shifted smoothly after repair or required more work. There was no ambiguity, no hidden meanings to decode, no emotional landmines to navigate. Dad noticed my natural affinity for the work and began teaching me more advanced techniques, showing me how to read the subtle signs that separated competent mechanics from true craftsmen. The way oil looked on a dipstick could reveal bearing wear patterns. The color and consistency of coolant told stories about maintenance habits and cooling system integrity. He taught me to feel vibrations through my hands, to hear the difference between normal operating sounds and the whispers of impending failure. My formal education suffered somewhat due to my obsession with all things mechanical, but Dad understood that some people learn better with their hands than their heads. He arranged for me to spend summers working at other garages in neighboring towns, exposing me to different approaches and techniques. Each shop had its own personality, its own way of approaching problems, but the fundamental principles remained constant. Quality work spoke for itself. Shortcuts always came back to haunt you. Customer relationships were built on trust and maintained through consistent performance. By the time I graduated high school, I could rebuild an engine from the ground up, diagnose electrical problems that stumped veteran mechanics, and handle the business side of automotive repair with the confidence of someone twice my age. Dad's pride was evident in the way he introduced me to customers during those final months before I left for technical college, his weathered hand resting on my shoulder as he proclaimed, "This boy's got more mechanical sense in his little finger than most folks have in their whole body." I married Sarah when I was 23, her patience balancing my stubborn nature. She understood that I'd always smell faintly of motor oil and that Rex would track mud through her kitchen. We raised 2 boys in the house behind the shop, teaching them the same lessons Dad taught me about honest work and keeping your word. Sarah had grown up on a farm 20 miles south of Millerville, the daughter of a M. and who raised cattle and believed that character was measured by how you treated animals and kept your promises. Her father, Thomas Brennan, was a stern man with gentle eyes who took my measure during our first meeting by watching how I handled his dogs and spoke to his livestock. Sarah later told me that he'd confided to her mother that night, "That boy understands that respect isn't just for humans." She saw something in me that complemented her own practical nature, and our courtship unfolded with the steady rhythm of seasonal cycles and shared values. Our wedding was held in the small Methodist church where Sarah had been baptized, with a reception in her family's barn that had been decorated with mason jars and wildflowers. Dad served as my best man, his uncharacteristic nervousness evident in the way he kept adjusting his tie and checking his pocket watch. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by 3 generations of families who had known each other since childhood. Sarah wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and I managed not to trip during the processional despite the unaccustomed formal shoes that pinched my feet. The reception lasted well past midnight, with music provided by Sarah's cousin Billy and his bluegrass band. Dad danced with Sarah's mother, his usual reserve melting under the influence of celebration and the glass of bourbon he'd been nursing all evening. I remember watching them from across the barn, thinking how perfectly they represented the kind of enduring partnerships that formed the backbone of small-town communities. The boys arrived in quick succession, Michael first, then David 18 months later. Each birth brought new dimensions to our lives, new responsibilities that somehow felt natural rather than overwhelming. Sarah proved to be a mother whose instincts rivaled her practical skills, managing our growing household with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. I converted the small bedroom above the garage into a nursery, installing extra insulation to muffle the sounds from below while ensuring adequate ventilation to prevent automotive fumes from reaching our children. The boys grew up surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of mechanical work, treating the garage as an extension of their playground while learning early the importance of safety around power tools and moving machinery. Michael showed an immediate fascination with anything that had wheels or an engine, while David gravitated toward the business side of operations, understanding customer relationships and financial management with an intuition that impressed even Sarah's father. I taught them both to drive using the various project cars that passed through our shop, ensuring they understood not just how to operate vehicles, but how to maintain them properly. Weekend afternoons often found us working together on personal projects, restoring an old pickup truck for Michael's 16th birthday or rebuilding a lawn mower engine that David had acquired from a neighbor's barn sale. These shared activities created bonds that transcended the typical father-son dynamic, establishing relationships based on mutual respect and common interests. The boys moved to Birmingham for corporate jobs when they reached their 20s, visiting on holidays with grandchildren who find my stories about the old days amusing. Michael landed a position with an engineering firm that designed manufacturing equipment, while David joined the management team of a regional bank. Both seemed happy with their choices, though I sometimes detected a wistfulness in their voices when they talked about their current work. Their children, Michael's 2 daughters and David's son, represent the 4th generation of our family to grow up around machinery and tools, though their exposure comes in measured doses during holiday visits rather than as part of daily life. Sarah and I took pride in their achievements, while recognizing that their paths necessarily diverged from the one we had chosen. Progress meant different things to different generations, and we respected their decisions even when they led away from the traditions we had cherished. Sarah passed 3 years ago, a heart attack that took her as suddenly as a summer storm. I found her in the kitchen where she'd been preparing lunch, collapsed beside the table where we'd shared thousands of meals over 4 decades of marriage. The paramedics worked for 20 minutes, but I knew from their expressions that she was already gone. Rex, who had been napping on the back porch, appeared at my side during those terrible moments, pressing against my leg with an intuitive understanding of grief that words couldn't capture. The funeral filled the Methodist Church beyond capacity, a testament to the countless lives Sarah had touched through her quiet generosity and unwavering kindness. Neighbors brought casseroles and offers of help that continued for months, but the fundamental emptiness of her absence remained unchanged despite their good intentions. The months following Sarah's death passed in a blur of routine activities performed without their former meaning. Rex stayed close during those dark months, sensing my grief in ways I couldn't articulate. He'd rest his head on my knee when the silence grew too heavy, reminding me that some bonds transcend words. His presence became my anchor during those times when the emptiness threatened to overwhelm whatever remained of my purpose. I found myself talking to him more frequently, sharing thoughts and memories that had no other outlet. He listened with the patience of a trained counselor, his amber eyes reflecting an understanding that seemed almost human. Gradually, I began to recognize that his needs provided structure for my days, feeding schedules, walks, veterinary appointments, small responsibilities that required me to function even when motivation was absent. The workshop became my sanctuary, the place where Sarah's laughter still echoed in the rafters. Every tool, every piece of equipment held memories of conversations we'd shared during the countless hours she'd spent keeping me company while I worked. She had developed her own appreciation for the craft over the years, learning to distinguish between different engine sounds and understanding the diagnostic process well enough to ask meaningful questions about whatever project occupied my attention. Her sudden absence left a void that extended beyond personal loneliness into the very fabric of my working life. The familiar routines that had once provided comfort now seemed hollow, mechanical motions performed without the warmth of her interest and encouragement. I specialized in classic restorations, bringing life back to vehicles that younger mechanics dismissed as scrap. Word spread through collector circles about the old-timer in Alabama who could make a '69 Camaro purr like new. My reputation grew slowly but steadily, built on the foundation of quality work and honest dealing that Dad had instilled in me decades earlier. Customers began traveling considerable distances to reach my shop, drawn by recommendations from previous clients and the growing recognition that craftsmanship of my caliber was becoming increasingly rare. Each restoration project presented unique challenges: sourcing obsolete parts, fabricating replacement components, researching original specifications. But these obstacles only intensified my satisfaction when completed vehicles exceeded their owners' expectations. Rex learned to distinguish between customers by their footsteps on the gravel drive, alerting me with different barks for regulars versus strangers. His ability to read people impressed even longtime clients, who often commented on his uncanny knack for determining their moods before they'd spoken a word. Regular customers received enthusiastic tail wagging and gentle nudges for attention, while strangers were assessed with polite but cautious observation until their intentions became clear. I came to trust his judgment about people almost as much as I trusted his mechanical instincts, using his reactions as an additional data point when evaluating potential clients. Some folks just rubbed him the wrong way for reasons I couldn't always identify, but experience taught me that his reservations usually proved justified. We developed our own rhythm, man and dog, moving through days marked by the satisfaction of honest work and small victories against time and rust. Morning coffee shared on the front porch while Rex conducted his territorial patrol of the property boundary. The familiar sequence of opening the shop, checking overnight emails for parts availability and shipping updates, reviewing the day's scheduled activities. Rex had his own routine that paralleled mine, investigating interesting scents that had accumulated overnight, checking the perimeter for signs of unwanted visitors, settling into his favorite observation post, where he could monitor both the workshop entrance and the approach road. Our synchronization had developed over years of shared experience, creating an unspoken communication system that eliminated the need for constant verbal interaction. The county auction house sits 5 miles down Highway 82, a cavernous building where abandoned storage units meet their fate. The structure itself tells stories of economic cycles and forgotten dreams. A former aircraft hangar converted to commercial use when the local airfield closed in the 1980s. High bay doors that once admitted military transport planes now accommodate moving trucks filled with the contents of defaulted storage units. Fluorescent fixtures hang from steel beams 30 feet above concrete floors, stained with decades of automotive fluids and industrial activities. The acoustics create an echo that transforms normal conversation into ghostly whispers that seem to emanate from the tacked merchandise itself. I'd been going there for years, hunting for vintage parts and tools that contemporary suppliers could no longer provide. The auction house represented a treasure trove for anyone willing to gamble on mystery lots and overlooked valuables. Rex always came along on these expeditions, his nose twitching at the mingled scents of forgotten lives and hidden treasures. The environment stimulated his senses in ways that our familiar workshop routine could not match. Hundreds of different smells layered upon each other, like geological strata, documenting decades of human activity. He had learned to navigate the crowded aisles without disturbing precariously stacked items, his movements careful and deliberate as he investigated whatever captured his attention. Other regular attendees had grown accustomed to his presence, some bringing treats they'd saved specifically for him. The auction staff welcomed him as an unofficial mascot, understanding that his calm demeanor and obvious training made him less disruptive than many of the human participants. That particular Tuesday in October, the air carried the first bite of autumn, and I noticed him acting strange. The seasonal transition always affected Rex's behavior somewhat, increased alertness as wildlife patterns changed, longer pauses during walks to investigate scent trails that told stories of migrating animals and shifting territories. But his demeanor that morning felt different, more focused than his usual autumn restlessness. He kept circling back to Lot 17, a rusty shipping container that had been sitting unclaimed for 6 months. The container itself looked unremarkable, standard 20-foot length, weathered green paint job, the kind of anonymous storage unit that could contain anything from household goods to industrial equipment. Its isolation in the auction yard's back corner suggested that previous buyers had overlooked it or dismissed it as unpromising. The auctioneer, Bill Henderson, mentioned it belonged to an estate that couldn't be contacted. Bill had been running these auctions for 15 years, his gravelly voice and authoritative manner commanding respect from regular bidders who understood that his assessments of lot values were usually accurate. He knew the stories behind most of the storage units that passed through his facility: family disputes, financial difficulties, military deployments that extended beyond original expectations. This particular container had arrived through a law firm representing an estate whose beneficiaries remained unlocated despite their investigators' efforts. "Starting bid $50, he called out. "Might be nothing but junk, but you never know." His tone carried the practiced neutrality of someone who had witnessed too many surprises to make definitive predictions about storage unit contents. Rex pawed at my leg, his amber eyes fixed on that container with unusual intensity that bordered on obsession. I'd learned to trust Rex's instincts over the years, experiences that had taught me to pay attention when his behavior deviated from established patterns. He'd once led me to a loose floorboard that revealed a '67 Mustang engine block, and another time his insistent barking uncovered a hidden compartment containing rare snap-on tools worth more than I'd paid for the entire lot. His success rate at identifying valuable items exceeded statistical probability, suggesting an ability to detect subtle clues that human senses missed entirely. But his behavior around that container felt different, almost urgent, as if he sensed something significant that required immediate attention. When I raised my hand to bid, several people chuckled, their amusement stemming from the apparent mismatch between the container's unprepossessing appearance and my reputation for shrewd purchases. "Old man's throwing good money after bad," I heard someone whisper, the comment carrying clearly in the auction house's echo-prone acoustics. The speaker was probably Jake Morrison, a parts dealer from Montgomery whose bidding strategy relied heavily on obvious visual clues and superficial assessments. Jake specialized in quick turnaround items that could be evaluated and resold within days of purchase, an approach that occasionally yielded profits but missed the kind of hidden values that required patience and deeper investigation. His dismissive attitude toward my bid reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how real treasures were discovered at auction, not through flashy appearances, but through careful observation and intuitive assessment of overlooked details. The bidding stopped at $60, and I found myself the proud owner of whatever mysteries lay rusting behind those corroded doors. Rex's tail wagged for the first time all day, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, his satisfaction evident in the way he practically pranced during our walk back to the truck. The container would be delivered to my property the following morning, giving me the entire evening to speculate about its contents and wonder whether Rex's instincts would prove accurate once again. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of discovery and nagging questions about what could generate such focused interest from a dog whose judgment I had learned to respect implicitly. The delivery truck arrived promptly at 8 a.m., the driver navigating my gravel driveway with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to making residential deliveries in rural areas. The container looked even more weathered in my yard than it had in the auction house, its green paint job revealing extensive rust damage that suggested years of exposure to coastal weather conditions. The delivery driver positioned it near my workshop according to my instructions, using hydraulic equipment to lower it gently onto concrete pads I had prepared the previous evening. Rex supervised the entire operation from a safe distance, his attention never wavering from the container, even when the diesel truck's engine noise and hydraulic whining should have captured his interest. Sleep came fitfully that week as I wondered what drew Rex to that container with such magnetic intensity. His behavior around the unit intensified rather than diminished after its arrival on our property. I'd walk past it in my yard, watching him sniff around the base, occasionally whining low in his throat in a manner I'd never heard before. The sound carried undertones of frustration mixed with anticipation, as if he could detect something important just beyond his ability to access it. His regular patrol routes now included multiple stops at the container, where he would investigate the same spots repeatedly, as though expecting changes in scent patterns that might provide additional information. The intensity of his interest began affecting his appetite and sleep patterns, clear indicators that whatever he sensed inside that container was triggering responses deeper than simple curiosity. The lock was industrial grade but old, and I recognized the manufacturer marking from my Navy days, 2 years of service that had taught me more about military equipment specifications than I'd expected to use in civilian life. standard military issue from the 1960s, the same type used on equipment storage facilities at every base where I'd been stationed. That detail gnawed at me, stirring memories of stories my father never quite finished telling about his service in Korea. He'd mention names of buddies who never came home, then change the subject when my questions got too specific about their circumstances or the nature of their missions. There was always something unfinished in his voice during those conversations, a weight he carried but never set down, secrets that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. Dad's war stories had always contained gaps that I'd attributed to the natural reluctance of combat veterans to discuss traumatic experiences. Most of the older men in our community who had served in Korea displayed similar patterns, willingness to share amusing anecdotes about military life, combined with obvious discomfort when conversations approached more serious topics. But Dad's reticence seemed different somehow, less about protecting himself from painful memories than about protecting others from information they weren't meant to possess. His references to special assignments and unusual equipment had seemed like typical military vagueness when I was younger, but mature reflection suggested they might have represented something more specific and significant. The day I decided to cut the lock, Rex positioned himself directly in front of me, as if claiming his role as witness to whatever we'd find. His behavior that morning carried in solemnity that seemed almost ceremonial, a recognition that we were crossing a threshold into unknown territory. The bolt cutters snapped through aged metal with surprising ease, decades of corrosion having weakened the steel despite its impressive appearance. The doors creaked open on hinges thick with rust, their protest echoing across the yard like the sound of secrets reluctantly surrendering to daylight. The afternoon light revealed neat stacks of wooden crates, military surplus by their markings and construction methods that matched equipment I remembered from my own service experience. Rex immediately began investigating the perimeter, his behavior shifting from curious to alert as his sensitive nose cataloged scent information that remained invisible to my human senses. The container's interior carried the distinctive odor of preserved military equipment, a mixture of cosmoline, aged wood, and metal that had been stored in controlled conditions for extended periods. But underneath those familiar smells, Rex seemed to detect something else that commanded his complete attention. That's when I noticed the small wooden box wedged behind the larger crates, almost hidden from casual view by shadows and strategic positioning that suggested deliberate concealment rather than accidental misplacement. Inside the box, wrapped in old cloth with military precision, were documents that made my blood run cold. The papers were in excellent condition despite their age, protected by preservation techniques that indicated their importance to whoever had stored them. Discharge papers bearing my father's name topped the stack, but these weren't the standard documents I'd seen among his personal effects after his death. These papers referenced classifications and assignments that had never appeared in any of his official records, activities that suggested involvement in operations far more complex than the routine infantry service he'd always described. Photographs of men I'd never seen accompanied the documents, uniformed figures posed beside equipment that looked both military and civilian in nature, their expressions carrying the serious demeanor of people involved in significant undertakings. The correspondence that followed painted a picture of post-war activities that challenged everything I thought I knew about Dad's military experience. Letters discussing something called Operation Homestead revealed a network of veterans engaged in recovery and documentation activities that extended well beyond their official discharge dates. The operation appeared to involve the identification, collection, and preservation of captured enemy equipment that possessed either technological or historical significance. Dad's role seemed to have involved authentication and evaluation, responsibilities that required expertise in mechanical systems and manufacturing techniques that his automotive background had provided. The final letter was dated 3 weeks after Dad's official discharge, signed by someone claiming to hold materials of mutual benefit. The correspondence suggested that Operation Homestead participants had been promised compensation for their continued involvement in what appeared to be a transition from military to civilian oversight of recovered materials. The language was carefully neutral, avoiding specific references to money or valuables, while making clear that participants expected to receive something of significant value in return for their cooperation and silence. The letter writer's tone conveyed urgency about maintaining operational security while ensuring that participants received their promised benefits. The revelation that my father had been involved in something beyond his stated service record sent me reeling, forcing me to reconsider fundamental assumptions about his character and experiences. Rex stayed close as I spread the documents across my workbench, his presence anchoring me as I tried to process implications that seemed to grow more complex with each piece of evidence. The photographs showed Dad with other soldiers standing beside crates identical to those now sitting in my yard, their poses suggesting familiarity and comfort with whatever they were handling. More disturbing were the financial records indicating substantial payments made to participants, money that never appeared in our family's circumstances despite decades of modest living that suggested we could have used additional income. The documents raised more questions than they answered, particularly regarding the apparent gap between promised compensation and our family's actual financial situation during my childhood. Dad had always worked long hours at the garage, taking on extra jobs during slow periods to ensure we had everything we needed. Our standard of living was comfortable but hardly luxurious, with careful budgeting required for major purchases and family vacations that rarely extended beyond neighboring states. If he had received substantial payments from Operation Homestead, those funds had either been hidden, invested in ways that provided no obvious benefit to our daily lives, or never received despite the promises documented in these letters. I spent sleepless nights piecing together the implications, my mind racing through possibilities that ranged from innocent explanations to scenarios that cast Dad's entire post-war life in a different light. The return address on several letters led to a post office box in Montgomery that probably hadn't existed for decades, but the correspondence patterns suggested an organized effort to maintain contact among Operation Homestead participants long after their official military service had ended. Rex watched me work, occasionally bringing me his tennis ball when he sensed my frustration mounting, his simple gesture reminding me of something Dad used to say: "When you can't see the solution, step back and look at what you know for certain." What I knew for certain was that someone had stored these materials with deliberate care, preserving them for a reason that suggested they retained significance decades after their creation. The correspondence suggested Dad and his unit had recovered valuable equipment during their classified mission, equipment that should have been turned over to military authorities, but instead appeared to have been diverted into civilian channels. The financial records indicated this diversion involved private sales to collectors and museums, with participants receiving substantial compensation that was supposed to remain confidential. But Dad had never shown any signs of hidden wealth, living and dying as a small-town mechanic whose greatest extravagance was the occasional fishing trip to Gulf shores. Either he'd been cheated out of his share, or he'd chosen not to claim it for reasons I could only guess at. The possibility that Dad had been victimized by more sophisticated participants disturbed me deeply, suggesting that his trusting nature might have made him vulnerable to exploitation by people with fewer scruples about profiting from questionable activities. Alternatively, he might have discovered something about Operation Homestead that violated his moral code, leading him to walk away from compensation that came with ethical strings attached. Both scenarios fit aspects of his character, while explaining the unfinished quality of his war stories and the weight he'd carried throughout his civilian life. My hands shook as I dialed the number for Colonel Webb's daughter, Margaret, whose contact information appeared in several of the later letters as someone who might be able to provide additional context about her father's role in Operation Homestead. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone accustomed to dealing with unexpected calls. When I mentioned finding documents related to her father and Operation Homestead, her sharp intake of breath told me she knew exactly what I was talking about, confirming that this wasn't the first inquiry she'd received about her father's post-war activities. "Where did you find those?" she asked, her voice tight with old anxieties that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation for years. I explained about the storage container and my father's involvement, providing enough detail to establish my legitimacy while respecting the obvious sensitivity of the subject matter. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear papers rustling in the background as if she were consulting documents of her own. "My father spent his final years trying to locate the other participants," she finally said, her tone carrying the weariness of someone who had inherited unresolved problems that predated her own involvement. There were debts that needed settling, promises that were never kept. She agreed to meet me the following weekend, bringing her own collection of documents that might fill in the missing pieces of a puzzle that had apparently frustrated her father until his death. The prospect of finally understanding the full scope of Dad's involvement in Operation Homestead felt both exciting and terrifying, opening possibilities that might fundamentally change my understanding of his life and character. Margaret's willingness to share information suggested that she viewed me as an ally rather than a threat, someone who might help resolve issues that had haunted multiple families for decades. Margaret arrived in a pristine Buick, her silver hair and careful manner suggesting retired schoolteacher or librarian, someone accustomed to organizing information and presenting it clearly to people who needed to understand complex subjects. Rex approved of her immediately, accepting her offered treats with the dignity he reserved for worthy strangers, his tail wagging gently as she spoke to him in the kind of respectful tone that recognized his intelligence. She carried a leather portfolio filled with correspondence between her father and government officials, documentation of his attempts to resolve what she called unfinished business from a forgotten war. Her organizational skills were evident in the way she had arranged the materials chronologically, with color-coded tabs that indicated different phases of her father's post-war efforts to fulfill commitments that had apparently haunted him for decades. The picture that emerged was troubling in ways I hadn't anticipated, revealing layers of complexity that extended far beyond simple financial arrangements into questions of legal authority and moral responsibility. Operation Homestead had indeed involved the recovery of valuable enemy equipment, but the promised compensation had been tied up in bureaucratic delays that stretched on for decades while participants aged and died without receiving resolution. Several participants had died waiting for resolution, their families never knowing about the money owed them or the circumstances that had created these obligations. Margaret's father had maintained contact with surviving participants and their families, documenting cases where promised payments had never materialized despite his repeated efforts to resolve the situation through official channels. The most shocking revelation came when Margaret produced a ledger showing outstanding payments, her father's meticulous record-keeping revealing the full scope of Operation Homestead's financial obligations. My father's name appeared with a sum that made my throat tighten, $47,000 in 1953 dollars, plus accumulated interest that brought the total to over $300,000 in today's money. The figure represented more than Dad had earned during entire years of operating the garage, a sum that would have transformed our family's circumstances if he had ever received it. The government finally settled these accounts 5 years ago, Margaret explained, her voice carrying both satisfaction at the eventual resolution and regret about the decades of delay that had prevented many participants from benefiting from the settlement. But they could only pay surviving participants or their documented heirs. Your father was listed as deceased with no traceable family. She handed me a business card for the Treasury Department official who'd handled the settlements, the government employee who had apparently spent considerable effort trying to locate remaining families without success. Mr. Patterson has been trying to locate remaining families. He'll be very interested to hear from you. The irony of the situation struck me forcefully. Dad's money had been waiting for him, and then for us, while we struggled through lean years that could have been alleviated by funds that were rightfully ours, but impossible to claim without information we didn't possess. The phone call to Patterson felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life or participating in a bureaucratic fairy tale where lost inheritances actually materialized after decades of dormancy. He confirmed Margaret's account and explained that my father's payment had been held in escrow, accruing interest while they searched for legitimate heirs using resources that had proven inadequate for locating people who had never known they were being sought. The process of proving my identity and relationship would require documentation and patience, but the money was rightfully mine as Dad's sole surviving heir. More importantly, he had information about why my father might never have claimed his share, details that had emerged during the government's investigation of Operation Homestead's financial arrangements. Some of these men felt conflicted about the whole operation, Patterson explained, his voice carrying the sympathetic tone of someone who had dealt with similar cases involving ethical dilemmas that had no clear resolutions. They'd been told they were serving their country, but the private sales aspect troubled them. Your father submitted a letter questioning the legality of the arrangement. He may have chosen to walk away rather than compromise his principles. The explanation resonated with painful accuracy, describing exactly the kind of moral struggle that would have kept Dad awake at night and influenced every subsequent decision he made about money and integrity. That detail rang true in ways that hurt to acknowledge, forcing me to confront the possibility that Dad's financial struggles had been self-imposed rather than circumstantially unavoidable. Dad had always been scrupulously honest, sometimes to his own detriment, returning overpayments to customers, refusing to charge for minor repairs, insisting that a man's word was worth more than his profit. The idea that he discovered something ethically questionable about Operation Homestead and chosen poverty over compromise fit his character perfectly while explaining the financial constraints that had shaped our family's lifestyle throughout my childhood. It also explained the unfinished quality of his war stories, the weight he carried that I'd never understood, the sense that he was protecting us from knowledge that might complicate our respect for his service. He'd made a choice that cost our family financial security, but preserved something he valued more: his integrity and his ability to look at himself in the mirror without shame. The realization brought a mixture of pride and frustration that left me emotionally exhausted, proud of his moral courage, while grieving for the opportunities his decision had cost our family. College educations that might have been easier to afford, family vacations that could have created different memories, the simple security of knowing that unexpected expenses wouldn't threaten our stability. All of these possibilities had been sacrificed to maintain ethical standards that most people would never have questioned or even understood. The settlement process took 3 months, during which Rex and I fell into a new routine of morning walks and afternoon contemplation that reflected the strange limbo of waiting for bureaucratic machine. Right to validate claims that felt both legitimate and surreal. The Treasury Department's requirements for documentation proved extensive but not unreasonable, requiring birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, and sworn statements that established family relationships and confirmed the absence of other potential heirs. Each form completed and submitted brought us closer to resolution, while emphasizing the complexity of situations where decades had passed between the creation of obligations and their eventual fulfillment. Money, when it finally arrived, felt both like a gift and a responsibility that carried moral weight beyond its numerical value. Dad's sacrifice had been redeemed in financial terms, but the burden of deciding how to honor that redemption fell to me alone. The sum was substantial enough to change my lifestyle significantly if I chose to spend it on personal comforts, but it also represented an opportunity to fulfill the values that had motivated Dad's original sacrifice. I paid off the small mortgage remaining on the property, eliminating the only significant debt that constrained my financial flexibility. A portion went into education funds for my grandchildren, ensuring they would have opportunities that previous generations had been forced to forego. The largest single donation went to the local veterans organization, which used the money to improve facilities and expand services for aging veterans who faced challenges similar to those Dad had endured. The remainder went into improvements for the workshop, upgrading equipment and expanding space for the restoration work that had become my passion rather than mere occupation. New tools, better lighting, climate control systems that would protect both ongoing projects and completed restorations from Alabama's humid climate. Each improvement felt like a tribute to Dad's memory, while enhancing my ability to continue the traditions he had established through his own dedication to quality craftsmanship. The workshop began attracting attention from collectors and enthusiasts throughout the Southeast, people who appreciated the combination of technical expertise and historical preservation that my work represented. The rusty container that started this journey now houses my growing collection of vintage tools, cleaned and organized with the respect they deserve after decades of neglect or abandonment. Rex has claimed a sunny spot beside it, where he supervises my work with the satisfied air of a job well done, his original instincts about the container's significance validated beyond any reasonable doubt. The transformation from mysterious storage unit to functional workspace symbolizes the broader changes that have affected every aspect of our lives since that October afternoon at the auction house. Neighbors who once mocked our purchase of nothing but junk now ask respectful questions about my restoration projects and the story behind our unexpected windfall, their curiosity tempered by recognition that significant discoveries sometimes emerge from sources that appear unpromising. I tell them what feels appropriate, keeping the deeper complexities of Dad's moral struggle private, while sharing enough information to satisfy their natural interest in dramatic reversals of fortune. Some truths are meant to be carried quietly, passed down through actions rather than words, honored through choices that reflect the values they represent rather than through detailed explanations that might diminish their impact. The experience taught me that inheritance isn't always about money or property, though financial resources certainly provide opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. Sometimes it's about understanding the choices that shaped our lives, the principles that our parents held even when those principles cost them dearly in material terms. Dad never lived to see his sacrifice redeemed, never knew that his ethical stance would eventually be vindicated through government recognition and financial compensation that acknowledged the injustice of broken promises. But Rex and I discovered that rust and time couldn't hide the truth, couldn't diminish the value of a decision made with integrity, even when that decision required enormous personal sacrifice. Every morning when I open the workshop doors, I feel Dad's presence in the familiar scent of oil and metal, in the steady rhythm of honest work that he passed down like a sacred trust that connects generations of craftsmen who understand that quality cannot be faked or shortcuts taken without eventual consequences. The grandchildren visit more frequently now, drawn by stories that have acquired new depth and meaning through our recent discoveries. They listen with greater attention when I describe their great-grandfather's dedication to his craft and his principles, understanding that his legacy extends beyond the mechanical skills he taught and the business he established. Rex serves as their guide during these visits, showing them around the workshop and the container that changed everything, his patience with their questions matching his earlier patience with my own struggle to understand the implications of what we had found together. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed how you understood your own story, that revealed sacrifices you never knew had been made on your behalf? I'd love to hear about it, because these discoveries remind us that every family carries mysteries that shape us in ways we're only beginning to understand.